The picture behind me is an allegorical representation of what the Catholic Church called the Babylonian captivity. In 1303, Pope Boniface VIII died in the midst of a political struggle with the King of France over whether or not a French bishop could be tried for treason. King Philip the Fair of France actually sent troops to arrest Boniface, and the elderly pope died after a short period in captivity. Well, after Boniface's death in 1303, the King of France resolved that the pope would never again oppose him in this way. So in 1309, the new pope was moved to Avignon, a small papal enclave in the south of France. For most of the 14th century, the popes were French, and the papacy was definitely under French control. The image behind me shows a personification of the city of Rome, dressed in black, sitting in the ruins and mourning the pope's departure. In Avignon, 7 successive popes consolidated their power within the church, in part by effectively taxing the clergy. But at the same time, they lost spiritual authority, as the papal court became one of the most luxurious in Europe. It was also clear that by moving to Avignon, the papacy had lost a degree of independence and was dominated by the French king. Well, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI decided that enough was enough and it was time to return to Rome. But rather than settling the issue, this only made matters worse. French cardinals simply elected a second pope who stayed in Avignon. There were now 2 rival popes demanding allegiance, and neither would recognize the authority of the other. Before this schism or split in the church was ended, there were actually 3 different people all claiming to be pope. Different areas of Europe declared allegiance to different popes, depending on who could be most useful to them. This dispute was resolved in the early 15th century, and the papacy remained permanently in Rome. But the institution of the papacy was severely damaged. In order to gain support from various rulers, the popes gave up a measure of authority over the churches in various parts of Europe. To compensate, they focused on heightening their own control over the papal states. In effect, after returning to Rome, the pope was becoming more and more like other European princes, motivated primarily by politics and constantly jockeying for secular power. It was a natural progression to the reign of the warrior Pope Julius II, patron of Michelangelo, who waged war on his neighbors like any other Italian prince. After this, the Protestant Reformation could not be far behind. The more the Pope acted like a secular ruler, the less spiritual authority he would command. Well, the late Middle Ages also saw an increasing criticism of clerical conduct in general. The mendicant orders of friars, the Franciscans and Dominicans, were particularly censured. The ideal was that friars should be poor saintly beggars, wandering the countryside preaching, fed and clothed by the charity of those they encountered, and this, in fact, was the life of St. Francis. The reality was that the mendicant or begging orders were increasingly wealthy. Their perceived purity led many people to bequeath money to them. This paradoxically led to the image of the fat friar as a cultural stereotype. Think of Friar Tuck in the Robin Hood legend. Fat and cheerful, always ready for a good meal and a pint of beer. Tuck, by the way, is English slang for food, so he's Friar Food. Friars were also popularly believed to be lecherous. The fact that they came begging at people's doors in the middle of the day when men were working in the fields and women alone in the house only exacerbated this stereotype of the friar as a seducer. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, finished in 1400, all of the clerical characters are represented as flawed or hypocritical. The monk spends all his time hunting like a nobleman. The prioress is a spoiled and ignorant young woman who flirts with everyone, wears expensive jewelry, and tells a hideously anti-Semitic tale. The friar is a glutton and a lecher, and the worst are the summoner, a thug who extorts money from people by threatening to bring them before church courts, and the pardoner, an evil charlatan who sells fake relics and false promises of salvation for money. The only exception to this rule is the idealized figure of the poor parson, who lives in poverty like Christ and the apostles, spends all his energy caring for his parishioners, and teaches morality not by sermons, but by example. Now, there probably were poor parsons in the 14th century, just like there probably were monks who lived like noblemen. But it's interesting that when Chaucer is surveying the clergy, he finds one idealized example of good behavior and many, many examples of bad behavior.